Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February 2019 meeting of the local New York Arts chapter. Tonight we have a very, very special program. It's entitled Roland Hayes, Legacy of an American Tenor. And our guest host tonight is Christopher A. Brooks. And I'll give you a little bit of a bio on him and show you how he is involved with the legacy of Roland Hayes and an upcoming CD issue that's going to be coming out representing some of his most famous recordings and some of his unknown ones, I presume. Christopher A. Brooks is a professor of anthropology at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and author of Roland Hayes, The Legacy of an American Tenor, with Robert Sims, published by Indiana University Press in 2015. And he will discuss the life, career, and recordings of the Afro-American lyric tenor who was born in 1887 and lived till 1977, who overcame racial prejudice and became a celebrated interpreter of art songs as well as spirituals. Christopher A. Brooks has produced numerous publications focusing on the African, continental, and Diasporan experience. He is the general editor of the 1,600-page reference work, the African American Almanac, 11th edition, published by Cengage and Gale, with a foreword by NAACP President and CEO Benjamin Jealous, which was published in February of 2011. Brooks wrote several major chapters for the volume, including Africa and the American Diaspora, Blues and Jazz, and African Americans in the Military. He is a contributor to the Encyclopedia of African American Culture, Greenwood Press, 2010, where he wrote the chapter HIV in the African American Church. His other publications include chapters in the African and African American Religions and Religion and War volumes in the Religion and Society series published by Routledge in 2000 and 2003. He has a chapter celebrating the centennial of W.E.B. Du Bois' landmark publication, The Souls of Black Folk, 100 years later, entitled The Souls of Black Folk, Can a Double Consciousness Be Heard?, published by University of Missouri Press in 2003. Where he examined the prophetic statement that Du Bois made about the crucial issue of the 20th century being the race question. As an internationally recognized biographer, Professor Brooks has produced several book-length manuscripts, including I Never Walk Alone, the autobiography of an American singer, with the late Shirley Verrett and John Wiley, published in 2003, now available in a Kindle version, which was published in 2011, and Follow Your Heart, Moving with the Giants of Jazz, Swing, and Rhythm, and Blues, with the late Joe Evans from the University of Illinois Press in 2008. Without further ado, Professor Christopher A. Brooks.
Good evening. And I have to say from the very beginning, I owe a good deal to this organization, mostly through my friend Tim Brooks, who I came to know about when I finished, I think it was maybe my second book, and I came across the name as he is a University of Illinois Press author as well, and I came across Lost Sounds as I was beginning to work on Roland Hayes. And I'm sure I talked to Tim, oh boy, multiple times, many times over the writing of this book because I wanted to get his feedback on one aspect or another. So I'm grateful to, he only needed to say come and that was it. So anyway, Tim, thank you. What I've done for this is I've broken this biographical presentation into several sections. So it's in 5 different sections. So it's not chronological the way you might ordinarily see it, and I think you'll see that as I'm going through. Now, let me make sure I get this right now with the shifting. Am I okay? Once known as the Black Caruso, Roland Hayes was hailed as one of the greatest concert performers of the 20th century. During his 60-year career, the gifted American packed concert halls all over Europe, in South America, and throughout the United States. Along with Fritz Kreisler, Ignaz Paderewski, Tito Schipa, John McCormick, Nellie Melba, Theodore Chayapin, and Pablo Casal. He was one of the few artists who could sell out famous venues like New York's Carnegie Hall, Washington's Constitution Hall, Boston's Symphony Hall, Covent Garden and Wigmore Hall in London, and the Hollywood Bowl. In 1923, he was the first African American musician to perform with a major symphony orchestra in the country, which led him singing with many world-renowned conductors under the batons of Eugene Ormandy, Leopold Stokowski, Otto Klemperer, Bruno Walter, Pierre Monteau, Sergei Kusevitsky, Sir Henry Wood, Walter Damrosch, Wilhelm Mengelberg, and Gabriel Pernier. Following the tradition of other celebrated musicians, he sang for crowned heads of Europe, prime ministers, presidents, and other heads of state. His trailblazing career carved the paths for Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson, Todd Duncan, Dorothy Maynor, and a host of other African American concert artists. He was also one of the few artists to routinely program African American spirituals, then known as Negro spirituals, on his recitals, and thereby began a tradition which continues among African American concert vocalists today. As a celebrated African American between the 1920s and the 1970s, his life was peppered with relationships that would place him among some of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Hayes counted among his personal friends and acquaintances George Washington Carver, Mary McLeod Bethune, Walter White, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ezra Pound, Pearl S. Buck, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Alain Locke, Harry T. Burley, A'Lelia Walker, and Langston Hughes. He also crossed paths professionally with the likes of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Thurgood Marshall, Haile Selassie, and with great stealth, Marcus Garvey. Roland Hayes always intended for his story to be told. To document his rich life, he left more than 100,000 personal papers and other materials, as is true for many Americans of African descent. It was much more difficult to document the life of his forebears seized in Africa and sold into enslavement in the American South. All who knew him from boyhood through his life as a celebrated concert artist remarked on his phenomenal drive and determination. That same tenacity served him well in uncovering the story of his ancestors. Roland Wiltsey Hayes was born in Calhoun, Georgia on June 3, 1887, in Little Row, later to be known as Curryville, Georgia, near Calhoun in modern-day Gordon County. He was the sixth of 7 children, and the family relocated to Chattanooga after the death of his father, when he was a preteen. He studied with the local teacher there, Arthur Calhoun, who exposed him to art music. He gained admission to Fisk Institute, later University, in 1906, where he studied with Jenny Robinson. After 4 years of study, Hayes and Robinson had a falling out. He left school at that point, well, actually was kicked out. And with the 4 years of training, though, especially during this time, it was almost as if you had a degree, because the fact that you were college trained was significant, and there were so few African Americans of this era who had that level of training. Again, it carried significant weight. He performed with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and in 1911, he was invited to go to Boston for a conference, and Roland Hayes ended up making it his home base for the remainder of his life. In Boston, he studied with a voice teacher highly regarded at that time, Arthur Hubbard. And it was Arthur Hubbard who would play a major role in helping to propel Roland. Now, he auditioned for several voice teachers, but it was only Hubbard who really thought that he could have a chance. But even Hubbard did not have an inkling that Roland Hayes would become as celebrated as he became. At a point, Arthur Hubbard advertised and said, the teacher of Roland Hayes. But again, he kind of banked on that celebrity. During what we would call the school year, Roland Hayes would study and work, and during the summer, he would travel to Chautauqua, Atlantic City, etc. And there he put together a group in 1916, called the Hayes Trio. Throughout the late 1910s, he toured nationally, but all of those concerts were self-managed. He collaborated with the accompanist Lawrence Brown, and it was Brown who would travel with him to Europe, to London specifically, although Hayes's intention was to go to London, to concertize and continue to Africa to discover the quote-unquote black voice, but he never set foot on the African continent. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now to the next part of this, and I refer to this as a unique mother and son bond. Now, there were many influences and people in the life of Roland Hayes who would help him to become the man and artist that he became. In fact, his 1942 biography was titled Angel Mo, which was short for Angel Mother, and her son, Roland Hayes. And it was a reference to his mother, Fannie Hayes. Fannie was she was the oldest child of Peter and Mandy, both of whom were enslaved, and Fannie herself was also enslaved. The best estimate that I could come up with her age was 1847. But you'll see some that are earlier, some were later, but she did not even know. The best she could come up with is that it was hot, so they guessed it was August, and there were other indicators, so this was the best. Her enslaved name was Pony, and she adopted Fannie as emancipation approached. In 1865, she met and married William Hayes, who was close to 30 years her senior. Roland, by the way, would like to say that in his publicity work, both of his parents were slaves, quote unquote. That's a term I don't use in my scholarship. But in fact, it was only his mother. His father, there's no record of the father ever having been enslaved, but the father did come from a Cherokee background. Fannie and William subsequently gave birth to 7 children. In 1886, Fannie Hayes purchased 10 acres of the very land on which she had been enslaved for $1 per acre in Gordon County, and that land still remains in their family some 130 years later. In 1926, Roland bought land directly adjacent to that of his mother and named it Angel Mo Farm. Mother Fannie, as she was often known, was never strongly supportive of Roland's career in music. Her often quoted dictum was, "They tell me Negroes can't understand good music and white people don't want to hear it from us. So it seems to me you're making a mistake." By that point, however, Roland would not be deterred. He was determined that he would become a world-class artist and would also take care of his elderly mother, and he did both. Over the course of several years, Fanny helped her son to reach one of his greatest personal epiphanies, and that was understanding the uniqueness of this black singing voice, as he called it. In 1921, after living for a year in the United Kingdom, Roland had a command performance from Buckingham Palace to sing before King George VI and Queen Mary. The news was reported around the world. Fanny was back in Boston when she was interviewed by reporters about her son's triumph. She appeared to be more interested in her laundry than speaking to reporters. When Roland cabled her about the news, her response to him was, "Give credit where credit is due." In September 1923, Fanny died, but not before seeing the beginnings of her son's remarkable rise to fame. Unable to be at the funeral in Boston because he was singing in Europe, Roland sent a recording that he made that year, 1923, of "Sit Down," and wanted it to be played at her funeral. Many of the spirituals which Roland had spread around the world, this one held special interest to Mother Fanny. Fanny's version of the spiritual told about an enslaved African woman in pre-Civil War South who had reached the age of 80 and knew her end was near. Sitting in her rocking chair, the angels asked her about her restlessness. She responded, "Lord, he'll say, 'Sit down.'" And they responded, "Sit down and rest a little while." With that final phrase, sit down, yes, my Lord, oh, hallelujah, in my kingdom," this was a powerful metaphor for Fanny Hayes' death. And once again, I'd like, let's see, it's Command and Tab. I'm not sure how to do this, but while you're coming down, this is the courtesy of Tim Brooks, because there is, in fact, a later version of Sit Down. Okay. And I want Sit Down.
Sit down. Just wait 2 seconds before you do that.
Okay. And just to give you a little background, that 1950 version was when I heard that, it was okay, but when Tim sent me the 1923 version, I said, oh my God, there's no comparison. So just to get an idea of Roland Hayes at his vocal height. Okay, and let's see, how do I go back to the, let's see, Command and Tab. Okay. And as I said, that was Roland Hayes at his height. Here is Fanny's grave marker, and it says, "Here lies the body of Fanny Hayes, born in Georgia, a slave, about the year 1842, and died in Boston, September 26, 1923. Her spirit, a permanently sacred and helpful influence, remains, and I can't make up that word, alert and blooming in our human family flower garden. Wife of William Hayes, deceased, mother of William Jr., deceased, Maddie, deceased, Nathaniel, deceased, John, deceased, and lying here, Robert, Roland, and Jesse, deceased. That is that Fanny outlived 5 of her 7 children, including her youngest, who was affectionately known as Baby Jessie. Let's shift gears again, and for this part of the discussion, a brief suspension of hate. 95 years ago, on May the 10th, 1924, Roland Hayes made his controversial debut in one of the premier artistic hubs of, Europe, Berlin. Among the 1,000-seat Beethoven Saal was a healthy dose of the recently formed political party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, more commonly known as what? The Nazi Party. He referred to this years later as his greatest triumph over hate. This era of Germany, the so-called Weimar Republic era from 1919 to 1933, this is when continental African soldiers had been introduced to the Rhineland after World War I with the authority to arrest and detain. Many married German women or had children out of wedlock. There were other Germans who complained about the Africans and their Afro-German children, and argued that this would lead to the bastardization of the German people. In his infamous work, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler accused the Jews of bringing the Africans into the Rhineland for the purpose of corrupting the purity of the German people. This was the kind of rhetoric often heard in the environment in which Roland Hayes would make his 1924 Berlin debut. And I do have to correct something about this, because when it was reported on in Time magazine and quoted in other sources that the debut took place in the fall of 1924, October 5th, 1924. And I couldn't find any record of it. What I was finding is that May of 1924, I said, okay, something's not lining up here. Well, of course, in Europe, they put the date, what? Day, month, and year. So someone saw 10/5/24 and interpreted that as October 5th, 1924. So it was, in fact, in May when the debut took place. The concert promoters were extremely excited. Roland Hayes was conquering Europe at that point, and so they put advertisements in a number of local papers. And some of you may be familiar with this story, saying that he was going to be singing the literature of Beethoven, or the leader of Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Schumann, and others. And this, of course, incensed a number of local Berliners, all the more because these were, of course, Germany and Vienna's most celebrated and sacred leader composers. One editorial sarcastically indicated the best Hayes could do for this audience would be to sing jazz or remind them of the cotton fields of Georgia. On the evening of his Berlin debut, Roland and his accompanist, William Lawrence, bravely walked on stage to be greeted by hisses and boos. From the hostile Berlin audience, Roland Hayes just stood silently without uttering a word, and the light was shining on him like a spotlight, as he recalled it, and that was it. So he just stood still until all of the hisses and boos went silent. And there was a prayer that he uttered to himself before performing, and it was, God, blot out Roland Hayes so that the people will only see thee. He shut his eyes, clasped his hands, and with a slight signal to Lawrence, began Schubert's celebrated Du bist die Ruhe, which was not programmed. And of course, you know that work, Du bist die Ruhe, der Friede mild, wie Sehnsucht du und was sie stillt. Ich weihe dir vor Lust und Schmerz, zur Wohnung hier, mein Aug und Herz, mein Aug und Herz. Kehr ein bei mir, du schließe, du, still hinter dir die Pforten zu, trabend an Schmerz von dieser Brust, voll sei dies Herz von deiner Lust, von deiner Lust. Die Zaulgenzelt von deiner Glanz allein erhält, o fühl es ganz, o fühl es ganz. And that repeats. So anyway, let me give you Roland Hayes' version of that. And let me see if I can get this now. Command and lock or command and tab? All right, let's see now.
Love
And here's a picture of the Beethoven Saal, Hitler's Mein Kampf, the music, Du bist die Du. Hayes's performance. Now, this particular performance that you just heard is from the 1950s, so you can hear it is a aged Roland Hayes who was well into his 70s by that time, and so there, of course, unless Tim finds it, no record of that 1924 or even of him recording it. He recorded it commercially, but again, what you just heard was a live performance. But still, the experience of him singing it is there and captures the essence. And I think if I had to pinpoint a part of this book that I enjoyed writing the most, it was this, with possibly one other exception. Yes? Was Reginald Boardman? That was Reginald Boardman at the piano. Yes, absolutely. Anyway, at the end of the performance, of that performance right there, and this was even before the actual concert had gotten underway, the audience went wild. And his detractors turned admirers came back to mob him. There was one American who was studying music in Berlin who shook the tenor's hand with an enthusiastic, "God damn it, put it there. This is the first time I've ever seen the Germans admit that good art can come out of America." And that was that event from 95 years ago when, as I describe it, there was a temporary suspension of hate, and Roland Hayes put that group in touch with their humanity. Now let me shift gears again. And this is called Roland Hayes, the Black Nationalist, with a question mark. Now, as I said, during the mid-1910s, as Roland traveled around the country building, that's the U.S., building his musical career, and met many well-known African American elites, including Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, musical personalities like Harry Burleigh, and as we'll see a little later, Daisy Tapley. It was not until his arrival in London in 1920 that he would interact with the smorgasbord of Pan-Africanist Brahmins operating in that city. He met the Pan-Africanist fiery enthusiast Muhammad Duze Ali, or sometimes you'll see it Duze Muhammad Ali, who offered Hayes and Lawrence Brown accommodations in his St. Woods rooming house. Duze Muhammad Ali was so strident in his denunciation of Britain's African colonist policy, he was routinely put under surveillance. By the time he met Roland Hayes, Ali had already inspired many others, most notably his one-time protege, Marcus Garvey. Now, this statement, I'm going to read what I have here, but then I'm going to correct it. It was from Duze Muhammad Ali that Garvey promoted his dictum made famous throughout the black world, Africa for the Africans. I have since found out that that phrase, Africa for the Africans, dates back to the mid-19th century in this country. So in any event, it's just a correction there. These Pan-Africanists were so taken by Roland Hayes, who sang benefit events to help raise money for the causes, etc. Within 5 months of his arrival, he was presented with a proclamation which read in part, "Roland Hayes, the Negro tenor. We realize that your success is our success, and that by proving that you are capable of the higher musical culture, you are rendering incalculable benefits to your race. As blood of our blood, flesh of our flesh, and bone of our bone, we wish you continued success in all your undertakings. We therefore beg that you will accept this slight token of our undying undying admiration and esteem. Sorry about that. In addition to Duze Muhammad Ali, the celebrated nationalist Dr. John Alcindor was also a signatory along with many others. In 1942, however, Roland Hayes became the focus of an international racial incident after he was assaulted in Rome, Georgia, by the local police. The news of this beatdown was heard around the world. The New York Times ran a headline read, "Beaten in Georgia," and that is it. Beaten in Georgia, says Roland Hayes, Negro singer, asserts he and wife were put in jail after a store dispute. And that's from July 1942. Civil rights icons like Walter White, Thurgood Marshall, Mary McLeod Bethune, and many others screamed to the top of their lungs about this dastardly deed. It even resonated all the way to the White House, where Eleanor Roosevelt did not come out openly to denounce it, but she was working it behind the scenes through the Justice Department. And as I said, she lent her voice to the humiliation of the tenor and would play a role in helping to resuscitate his career, because even by the mid-1940s, his career was on a downward trajectory. The Depression era had been hard on him in the 1920s, where he was commanding a fee of $2,500 per recital. It decreased, increased, and decreased, and it was down to about between $500 and $800 by the end of the 1930s. Although Roland Hayes was far from being a nationalist in the tradition of Garvey, Du Bois, and many others, he was nonetheless thrown back into the limelight by this particular incident. And just to give you a little of that, he was invited to go to Europe and perform for the troops there, and this would help, as I said, resuscitate his career. A year after the assault, his friend Langston Hughes summed up the Rome, Georgia experience in an essay entitled "My America," in which he said, "America is a land where the best of all democracies has been achieved for some people, but in Georgia, Roland Hayes, the world-famous singer, is beaten for being colored, and nobody is jailed, nor can Mr. Hayes vote in the state where he was born. Yet, America is a country where Roland Hayes can come from a log cabin to wealth and fame in spite of the segment that still wishes to maltreat him physically and spiritually, famous though he is." Now, I want to shift again. Come to the juicy part now. Bring me a queen. This was Fannie Hayes' admonition to Roland, and in fact, all of her sons. She said, "If you marry a white girl, boy, bring me a queen. Otherwise, stay in your own race." Fannie's most famous son didn't heed his mother's advice. On October 11th, 1923, the evening of his Prague debut, Roland Hayes walked out of his hotel bathroom and was shocked to find the regal 6-foot striking beauty, the Countess Berta Katarina Nadine Colorado Mansfeld, standing in the middle of his room unannounced. And there she is. The only thing he could muster was, "Oh, excuse me, I haven't quite finished dressing." Unfazed, the stately beauty, whose Habsburg ancestry dated back hundreds of years, charmingly introduced herself, and this began a 45-year relationship between the two, which was passionate, secretive, turbulent, transcendent, yet, because of the times, ultimately doomed. Roland met the Countess literally weeks after his mother Fanny's death, and without question, she filled a void in the vulnerable tenor's life. Months after having met Countess Bertha, Roland wrote a letter to his friend Alain Locke, whom he referred to as Leroy. And here's what Hayes wrote. Dear boy, my life is so beautiful and satisfying now that my cup of joy remains perpetually at a state of overflow. I never expected to have so much happiness in this life as the success of my work, which is my meat and drink, has brought me. My darling mother passed on to bring all of this to me, and I recognize her individuality and her great love in it. So although he didn't name her, it was clear Roland Hayes was speaking about his mother and somehow connecting the death of his mother to the entrance of the Countess into his life. By the time Roland arrived in Prague in April 24, he and the Countess had been exchanging increasingly passionate letters in which the tenor surrendered his natural guardedness and confessed his total delight in her friendship. I only have one letter, but it was a powerful one. On April 29th, as his train pushed across Central Europe, the tenor started a stream of consciousness letter to her. He poured out his swelling emotions, finishing the correspondence several days later when he seemed satisfied that he had left no doubt in her mind that the experience of working with her had fundamentally transformed him as an artist and as a man. And here he starts, 29th morning, Budapest, April 29th, 1924. What a great revelation, and you, my revealer of wonders, have caused a great illumination in my heaven sky. With complete abandon, he refers to Bertha as my divine, my strength, my comfort, and makes other unambiguous declarations such as, I can never be without you and your presence. In his autobiography, Angel Mo, and I tell you, I read that book 3 times, word for word, line for line, read right over it every single time, but he actually describes her. He doesn't name her, but he describes who she is in that book, but never gives her name. He says, he credits this nameless Countess Bertha, and who was the mother of 4 sons and was married to Count Hieronymus Colorado Mansfeld. He simply said, to this lady, I owe the real beginnings of my intellectual life and my musical maturity, and that she did. She exposed him not only to an incredible amount of musical literature, but even pronunciations in the Beethoven to emphasize the L in Liebe or Madre or other kinds of performance practices that he credits her with and in his performances. As if there was a little question, Roland and Countess Bertha consummated their relationship in Spain in 1924. The idea of an African American man having a child with a married woman of the old European aristocracy at the time was daunting, to say the least. The implications for his carefully crafted career was nearing a peak, and that was obvious. I'll say a little bit more about that a little later. But just to say, these were not the pronunciations of a lovesick teenager. Roland Hayes was moving towards 40 when he wrote that letter. So again, but this was the most passionate letter of all of the communications, and Roland Hayes did not intend for this letter to be revealed. It came from the opposite way. The nephew of the Countess had obtained the letter, Ernest Colorado, and he sent it to me. And so with that one letter, I was able to put together the passion and seriousness of this relationship. Roland and the Countess had a daughter because her goal was to blend the best of the blacks, as she put it, and the best of the whites, which was her lineage, and to come up with a new race. She called it her cause. Their daughter, Maria Dolores Francisca Colorado Krakowski, soon to be known as Maya, was born at 2 a.m. on February 12, 1926, in Basel, Switzerland. Roland was in Boston awaiting the news. His response to Bertha's telegram announcing their daughter's birth was more resigned than paternal, and he said, "Truth is supreme. I'm going on in silence and solitude." By the I don't think that's not going to come out too well. But this was a cartoon, a parody of, as the news was leaking out about the relationship between Roland and the Countess, and both of them denied it. And just you in picture one, you see the women, well, before that in picture one, the women are fighting it out and punching each other, trying to get a ticket to Roland Hayes' concert. In picture two, there he is singing on the stage, and there's a, "Isn't he lovely, beautiful?" And says that the Countess Helena Colloredo, misspelled obviously, a high-born lady of the Austrian royalty and the Kaiser's court. In picture three, you see the Countess fell head over heels in love with the tenor, never missing a concert, inviting him to her house. Picture four is where supposedly Roland and the Count had a fight, and Roland won. It was important to say, and the Countess and Roland went off. In reality, however, she wrote very passionate letters to him, and Roland had them, but he put them in a envelope that landed in my hands, a folder, and it said on the folder, "This envelope is to be destroyed upon my death. It is only to be seen by my wife, Helen Alzada Hayes, and destroyed by anyone else." And that's where these letters were. I didn't open it. I wasn't the one, but in any event, they were not destroyed, and I got them. And this really opened up that whole aspect of Hayes's life that he didn't want revealed. There were letters that the Countess had written to his lawyer saying things like she would never give him up, and that if her mother, the Countess Colloredo Mansfeld, contacted him, he was to say so and so, but she said she would not give him up. And that was it. But she never divorced the Count either. Just to be clear, they never divorced. They went on living as husband and wife, but the Count bought a chalet for the Countess in southern France, and that's where she and the daughter, Maya, lived. Maya wrote letters to Roland Hayes, but they were in code. In other words, when she referred to Roland, she used the name Mario. And when she referred to the Countess, she used the name Lady Fair. And so you just had to decipher who she was talking about. And she had a fixation on coming to the United States and learning about the Native Americans and so on and so forth, but none of that happened. In the meantime, Roland Hayes had an official family. He married his first cousin, Alzada Mann, and there she is with their young daughter, Africa, who was born in 1933 in the center there. In the meantime, Roland Hayes, Maya was growing in southern France, and there a young man who was an escapee from Russia landed, and by the way, the Countess also hid escaping Jews who had run from Germany, and she hid them in the chalet there. And Maya referenced it. She didn't call them that. She just said, "our guest." But it was clear that that's what they were because the envelope were screened by censors. So it was all done in code. This young guest from Russia by the name of Yuri Bogdanov came and met Maya. They both love horses. And all of a sudden, anyone familiar with that term, Ohrfeige? Ohrfeige is that slap that the mother gives the prospective son-in-law once he has impregnated the daughter. And that Ohrfeige she gave him, and that meant they were getting married. So in 1949, Maya and Yuri Bogdanov had twins. And here the countess with the twins, Igor and Grishka Bogdanov, born in 1949. And I had the opportunity to meet them in France. They're well known as I was working on the book, and I guess that was in 2008 when I went there to meet them. In the meantime, here was Roland Hayes' official family with Roland Hayes, Alzada, and their daughter, Africa. In southern France, there was Maya with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of her 6 children with the twins. This is with the twins as teenagers at that point. But it was a difficult relationship, to be sure. Maya would go years without seeing Roland, but at one point in the mid-1930s, the Countess came with Maya as a little girl and was in Paris, where Roland Hayes was singing a recital, and Roland Hayes was there with his wife, Alzada, and Africa in the same audience. They never met, but again, they were in the same audience. And so there were those kinds of, yes?
Did you say all these children are Roland Hayes?
Oh, no. All of these children are grandchildren of Roland Hayes. His daughter is on the end, and she would be the mother of 6 children. Okay? Yes. Okay. The twins met Roland Hayes in 1954 when they were 5 years old. He went to Paris, and Maya brought them to meet their celebrated grandfather, and he sang for them, and they came back the following day, and Maya asked her father if he could assist her financially with the twins. He said, "I'll think about it." But in fact, that was Roland Hayes, and she didn't know that was Roland Hayes's way to avoid saying no straight out. Just simply, "I'll think about it." And so this was, in fact, the last time that Maya saw her father in 1954. She grew bitter and became, abused alcohol among several other things, but here's the Countess in the 1960s, and there it went. Roland Hayes died on January 1st, 1977, but he left a family in France that they knew him through the Countess. She died 5 years later, as did Maya, the same year of bone cancer, 1982. But the story didn't stop there. Here is a wedding in 2009. And these are the descendants, the European descendants of Roland Hayes, with the exception of Ernest Collerot in the center there. But these are the grandchildren and some of their children of Roland Hayes. The occasion was the marriage of Igor Bogdanov, who is sitting there with the sunglasses on. And if you see them now, they've had this, I don't want to use the word on tape, but a lot of plastic surgery and probably exaggerated looking. So in any case, there it is. Here, as a result of this book, and I guess this was a serendipitous result of this book, the European relatives of Roland Hayes met up with the American relatives through one of the granddaughters who approached one of Africa's daughters, because Africa knew about the Countess, because after Roland Hayes died, she wrote Africa asking if she could get the letters that she had written to Roland returned, and Africa said she didn't know anything about them, which is certainly a possibility. Here is Roland Hayes's great-grandson, Wenceslaus, and this was in 2015, March 2015, at a, maybe it was the fall, at a Lincoln Center concert where my collaborator, Robert Sims, was doing a Roland Hayes concert. And there was a panel afterwards. Here is his granddaughter, Africa's oldest daughter, Zeta. And in 2017, the house at Allerton Street was made into a landmark in Brookline, Massachusetts. And former Governor Dukakis was there, and here is the marker that was placed there. That, of course, is the book. And I do want to play a Roland Hayes is not yet play what his voice sounded like in his later years. Let's see.
In offering these Afro-American religious folk songs of my forefathers on this disc, I wonder if people generally are aware of their serious and intensely spiritual nature, both before and after the emancipation of the slaves. Devout religious leaders of my people intoned song sermons with such conviction and fervor, comforting the oppressed and envisioning hope to the future, both in this world and the next, that through them the Spirit of God and the vision of a better world became a unifying and living force. There is no foolishness or frivolity in these religious songs, and that's why I sing them in the serious spirit which characterized them in their original settings. The hope of freedom was a source of deep-seated spiritual strength for my people in slavery, and their hearts murmured when it was not expedient for their lips to speak it. Slavery cannot imprison the soul, nor can adversity crush the spirit in man.
Now, as I conclude, I have committed myself at this point in my career to telling that African-derived experience, and I've written about celebrated names like Shirley Verrett, of course Roland Hayes, but lesser well-known individuals like Joe Evans. My current manuscript, which I've recently completed a draft of, is an outgrowth of the Roland Hayes book. And again, I have to thank Tim Brooks, because it was in The Lost Sounds, his work, that I came across the name Daisy Tapley. I read about her in Tim's book, and I said, wait a minute, I remember seeing letters about that name. And so I went back to scrutinize because I spent months going back between Richmond and Detroit going through that entire collection and coming across letters that she had written to Roland, and he held on to everything. And in that very envelope that he didn't want read, there were 2 letters that he held of Daisy Tapley as well. And so she piqued my interest, but there are only 2 extant pictures that I've been able to find so far of Daisy Tapley. One of them is, this is the William Walker Company in Dahomey, and I don't have a pointer, but there is Daisy 1, 2 from the left on that row. And here is the better known picture of Daisy Tapley. She lived between 1882 and 1925, and she encountered Roland Hayes when he was a student at Fisk. And again, this was uncovered as a result of writing this book, and she recognized his talent right away. She was born in Michigan and raised in Chicago, and she was, although I was first exposed to her as a singer, she was in fact a very accomplished pianist and organist. In fact, that's where her real training was, on piano and organ. She met and married Green Tapley, and he is in this picture. He's on that last row. If you come in 1, 2, 3, with his head slightly leaning, that is Daisy's husband, Green Tapley. They married in 1901 and joined, Green was already a member of the William Walker Vaudeville organization, but he persuaded them to employ Daisy. And she often worked as a coach, accompanist, and sang in the chorus as well. While they were in England, Daisy met Samuel Coleridge Taylor, along with several other well-known British musicians. Also on the trip, well, here's a bill from in Dahomey in New York. Oh, that didn't get it. This was in England, a postcard with George Walker, his wife, Ada Overton Walker, Burt Williams, and off to the left, Hattie McIntosh is there, and Will Marion Cook's wife, Lottie, is on the far side. You just can't see them there. But also on that trip was a young soprano, well, young in that she was a year younger than Daisy, born in 1883, Minnie Tapley, and here she is. And she eventually became Daisy's domestic partner. Today we would call it a same-sex relationship. Historically, Daisy would be the first African American, Tim says probably, and I'll just go a little further, and since nothing has come out to refute that, to record commercially, and that's what I'd like to play, that example of Daisy Tapley from 1910 with Carol Clark, I Surrender All. And that repeats. Throughout the 1910s, Daisy was in high demand as a singer, and most people who knew her as a singer had no idea that she was as accomplished a keyboardist. As I said, both organ and piano. she played with Hayes, or they did several recitals. And in 1917, when it was one accompanist, and I'm not sure which one of Hayes' accompanists, backed out at the last minute when he was about to do a tour of Canada, upstate New York, and he contacted her and asked her if she could step in at the last minute. She said, okay, and they went on this tour. But in 1913, she performed the role of Katisha in Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado, and she coached that role with the celebrated British contralto Clara Butt. And again, this was Daisy's foray, her first foray into opera. But here, okay, you don't see, this is a of the Elijah that they did in, this particular one was at Jordan Hall in Boston, and you had Hayes, Minnie Brown, Daisy, and Harry Burleigh. And so they kind of loosely called themselves the Elijah Quartet, if you will. Daisy passed away in February 1925 of ovarian cancer, and I am actually going to Sag Harbor tomorrow, which is where she is buried, to see where she is buried at Oakland Cemetery. And this has really been a remarkable effort for me. When I'm writing books, I sometimes wake up at 3 a.m. with my mind racing and so on, but it never happened with writing this book for some reason. So I don't know, there's something there. But I'll go ahead and stop there and see if there are any questions. But I thank you for the invitation and for your coming out tonight. Yes, sir.
Hold
Oh,
on.
sorry.
Let's get the mic. Do you have the mic, Mike?
Mike.
Mike.
First, a quick question. That performance of the Mikado, was that a black company?
Yes.
Or was it a mixed company?
Yes, it was. It was. There is the singer who sang the Mikado was Arthur Summer Wormley, and I again came in contact with that name through Tim and with Roland Hayes. They sang the duet in La Forza del Destino, and Tim sent me that recording as well, as did Steve Simolian, sent another version of it too, well, the same version of it, and he's the one who sang the Mikado. And so Daisy was really the star because the director of it was Jesse A. Shipp, who she had known from when they did In Dahomey in the early 20th century. So he built the production around her.
One other quick question.
Sure.
Lawrence Brown didn't remain Roland Hayes' accompanist.
No.
Was it for a particular, did they have a falling out?
They did have a falling out. Lawrence Brown wanted, for lack of a better way, parody with Roland Hayes. And because Roland was the star, he wanted to be in a stronger position, and he did, was in that when he was Paul Robeson's conductor. In fact, he even appears in a few of those Paul Robeson movies. But Roland Hayes' most devoted accompanist was not Lawrence Brown or William Lawrence. It was Percival Parham. And he is the one who was devoted to Hayes. And he was prepared to be a page turner, but when William Lawrence backed out, they were going to Russia. Roland was going to Russia, planned this tour to Russia, and William Lawrence backed out, saying he wanted more money, and that was it. So Roland Hayes wired Percival Parham. Percival Parham came, and that was it. And Percival Parham died tragically, as I believe in maybe in the well, I don't want to guess, it's there in the book, but Roland really mourned Percival Parham's death. And that's when Reginald Boardman came in, and Reginald Boardman was with him up to the end.
Are there any recordings with Hayes and that devoted accompanist?
I'm not aware. Tim, are you? Yeah. I'm not aware of any record. Hayes had this real, I don't know, it was like vicidarte, snobbery about him. He had the opportunity to sing at the White House under when Roosevelt was there, and he turned it down because they had paired him with a jazz singer, and he felt that it was inappropriate for what he did to be put on a program, even though they weren't singing together, but to have a jazz singer put on the same program, he wouldn't have it. And he didn't realize that by not recording very much in his heyday, that his name could have probably been even bigger. Fortunately, we do have recordings from the 1910s and a few of the 1920s, but by and large, there's that gap, and they don't come until much later. Yes, sir.
Hi. No, you said that once he went to Boston, he lived there and operated out of there for the rest of
Yes,
his life.
that was his home base.
Yeah, but you also mentioned that he bought property after his mother had bought property down in Georgia. Did he
That's
live in
right.
both places?
Yes, he would go to Angel Mo Farm even after the mother died.
Mm-hmm.
He would go there and spend his summers there, and kind of regroup and be in touch with himself, all of that, and even in his book in Angel Mo, there was a white Canadian young man who came to study with him, but being in the 1940s. He was the white Canadian young man was told he couldn't stay there with this black family. Well, after the Hayes book was completed, the daughter of the young man contacted me and gave me the background on him, and that he lived in Canada. She told me what he had done, that he had the family had a business, and he broke because he wanted to have a career. Traveled all the way to Georgia to study with Roland Hayes, but then had to leave because of the racial pressures of the time. But yes, he lived in both places. After the assault in 1942, Roland Hayes eventually sold the farm in 1947 and bought a farm in Massachusetts and named it, sounds like a minstrel name, frankly, Roalza Farm. Okay, so it was a combination of his name and and that of the wife. So anyway, that's it. And they eventually sold that.
Thank you.
Could you elaborate a little bit on his lack of recording? From 1923 to 1939, as you know, he made
Yes.
no issued recordings. Certainly, he knew Paul Robeson, enormous success, both with recordings and later films. Hayes didn't do radio, he didn't do films, he didn't do recordings, even though by that time other African American singers were quite successful in those various fields. Why do you think at the peak of his fame, when he could have commanded what he wanted, he avoided all media?
Well,
virtually?
he actually wanted to do film. He made a real strong effort at trying to do film. He met with the Hollywood producers, and he lied that he had put together this, I'll call it a pageant, and said he was ready to produce it, and went through several stages of trying to get close to it, even lying in a newspaper article saying he will not compromise his art, for his people, etc. But the reality is that he was quite envious of Paul Robeson. Here's this strapping 6-foot Adonis, if you will. No, Roland Hayes very much wanted to do film. In fact, I guess it was the 1950s, the South African Lost in the Stars, but it was the Cry the Beloved Country. There was a film version of that Sidney Poitier was in, but Roland Hayes auditioned to play the role of Stephen Kumalo. But they ended up using the Canada Lee as the Stephen Kamala, but Roland Hayes coveted that role, and once again lied after he didn't get the role and say, I told him I wasn't available, but he really went out to lobby hard to get that role, but it went to Canada Lee as a more established actor. So, but back to the recordings. To the best of my knowledge, Tim, it was Roland Hayes turning up his nose at being on the radio and being in the recording studio. Why? I'll just say part of it is an enigma, because you're right. There are only those few recordings from his height when he was really singing at his best. But there is that gap from 1923, as you said, to 1939, and he rejected being on the radio. He rejected making recordings, but he did want to appear in movies, though.
Do you have any sense why the 1935 Victor tests were never issued?
I don't know. I don't know. And again, let me be clear. When it comes to the recordings, I had to defer to Tim. And as I said, he sent me, what was it, 2 or 3 versions of that 1923 sit-down? Yeah, so anyway, no, I don't know why they weren't issued. Yeah.
I don't either. That's why I asked. The files are there for them, so we know they were made. I think there were maybe 4 or 5. There weren't very many.
Okay.
And it was rather obscure material. I think another issue was he wanted to record something other than spirituals. He wanted to record Schumann and
yes, of
very
course.
Esoteric kinds of stuff, and the record companies wanted spirituals.
Yeah.
And there might have been some tension there. And what he recorded for Victor in 1935 was this esoteric stuff. I don't recall.
Probably, it may have very likely been Percival Parham during that time. Yeah, probably Percival Parham, because they were together, and even when Roland Hayes was in an accident and Percival Parham was waiting for him on the West Coast, he said, and since Roland Hayes wasn't performing, Percival Parham was in a tough financial situation, but Roland Hayes made good on it by making sure that he was paid for those performances that he was expecting but missed, though. So yeah, that was a real strong bond between him and Percival Parham. But I tell you, I am all ears, Tim. If anything comes up about that, I'll make sure I'm one of the first who you let know about
Or
that.
those 1935 recordings,
That's what
which
I'm
have never
saying.
surfaced
Those
either.
1935 recordings, yes, absolutely.
Could I maybe shed a light on that?
Oh, please, by all means.
Seth's got them.
Seth, oh,
Were they marked in the? Yeah, right. No, they're in the left cubbyhole I just emptied out during my flood. 1935 was also a banner year, right, Joe? The Joseph Hoffman test that never came out? Possibly the fact that it was the depths of the Depression still.
yeah.
And they ran tests. If there were 4 sides, you know, the A&R department in RCA was just the biggest bunch of horses' asses at that point. You know, there was a story that Rachmaninoff wanted to record his major repertoire. What were they having him do? All his encore pieces. His concerti later on, and he only recorded 2 major pieces. So they were incredibly conservative over at RCA, and probably due to the Depression. And then they said, well, what market do we have here? Not much. Why put it out?
Yeah, that depression is probably one of the best reasons because, again, everything seemed to have dried up. Certainly, Roland Hayes had to go down on his fee, several other things, but frankly, I don't know a whole lot about it.
I wouldn't be surprised if he probably paid for part of the recording session like he did when he made his first records for
He
Columbia.
very well could have.
There's something about
Yeah.
there being problems with the recordings themselves, and there being noises and things like that in the background.
RCA Victor at the time, you know, they had a lot of problems.
Well, they might have also thought with Marian Anderson that they didn't need 2 people doing the same.
Yeah, well, Marian Anderson had more of an exposure. You know, she was much better known.
Yeah, as Paul Robeson as well. Yes, so he was
Yeah.
that up and coming name
And they're
as
looking,
well.
going, who are we going to sell this to? Especially in the depths of the Depression, if it's going to be sold down south, who's going to buy it? Who has the money?
There you are.
That's the whole thing. You know,
But still, if they emerge,
yeah.
let me know. I'll do another edition and incorporate that material.
Does it say anything on the sheets? Did it say hold, master, or D for destroy? Do you remember anything? See, that's the whole thing. If something wasn't approved
Okay.
right away, they would put a D next to destroy, which means destroy the metal parts. Melt them
okay.
down, reuse
Right.
them again.
Right.
So if there's a D, the only way it would survive is as a set of reference test presses.
Now, is there a record? I just got the latest edition of the Alan Sutton book. Are there
Okay.
records of it in that work?
I don't know.
No? Oh, okay.
Right.
I see.
So,
All right.
all right, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Christopher.
Okay.
Most enlightening.
Thank you.
Most enlightening.
Okay. And could you take a picture of me with Tim?
Okay, we'll take care of that in a second. I just want to let everybody know what's happening next month. Next month is going to be a real techie one, but a very fascinating one. Bob Shuster of Shuster Sound, otherwise known as Midnight Bob, is going to be interviewed by Marco Suero Ball from WNYC, and the title of their program is called Maintaining Vintage Analog Audio Equipment in a Digital Age. And Bob has some very, very interesting stories to tell about, you know, how to maintain equipment. Where I work during the day, during the week, he has come down to repair equipment that we thought could never be resurrected. He resurrected a tape recorder that I've had for 25 years and had it ready within 3 days, and it's working like a top. Man is absolutely incredible. He'll go almost anywhere. He's got a tool bag with him and get things fixed, or you bring it to him, and he knows exactly what to do. It should be a terrific evening. I was having a discussion with him about who was putting out some of the crummy tape back in the 60s, and he told me, oh yeah, it was this person who used to get the rejects from Ampex and Scotch and then repackage it for the various retail stores like Lafayette and Radio Shack of that era. Some of the older people will know what I'm talking about. Yes, well, white box tape. That was even better. Well, anyway, folks, enjoy the evening. We'll see you exactly a month from tonight, March 21st, and the usual time, 7 o'clock. And enjoy the weather until it changes into something. I don't know what. And thank you again, Christopher. Good evening to all.